To escape a prison, Daedalus constructed 2 pairs of wings made from feathers and wax for him and his son Icarus. There were 2 rules that had to be followed if they were to escape. Don't fly too close to the water and don't fly too close to the sun. For a while they flew perfectly safely, but enticed by the air and the freedom of soaring where only the gods and the birds had, Icarus flew heavenward, eventually causing the wax to melt and him to drown in the ocean. This is a Greek concept called hubris, a term that means excessive pride or self-confidence. It's seen in a lot of Greek stories, Arachne weaving a tapestry of the god's sins, Achilles driven to anger, Odysseus enraging the god of the sea. These laid the foundation for what we call fatal flaws, which in storytelling is a character flaw directly tied to their downfall. We still use terms like Achilles' heel, or maybe you've heard idioms like, what is this character's kryptonite? These fatal flaws of characters are a fundamental part of character work and storytelling. It's Light's pride, Griffith's ambition, Makima's misconception of love. All of these things are what make characters understandable and relatable. Flaws are what make a character grounded. So what if I told you that all of it is a lie? My name is Josh, I'm the host of Beyond Media, and in this video we'll be talking about the illusion of flawed characters. Now, there are generally 3 different types of character flaws, and exploring them will help us answer the question of this video, which is, how are character flaws lies, and why does it matter? First, there are minor character flaws. These are flaws that generally don't drive or disrupt the plot in serious ways. You might throw Elle's odd social presence or Deku's crying in this category. They matter and are a part of what gives the character texture and leads to other things, but aren't necessarily the end-all be-all expressions of that character. This is also where you might notice that sometimes character flaws aren't inherently moral. A lot of the times they are, but they don't inherently need to be. It's actually the absence of an inherent moral implication that will make a lot of characters feel more resilient and powerful. Next up, we have major character flaws. As you might be able to infer, these are flaws that have a significant impact on the character going forward and once again don't need to be morally negative. Denji's misconception of love is a fundamental flaw, much like how it is for Makima. However, both handle it very differently. These, at their core, don't necessarily place any moral implications on the characters, more so for Denji than Makima. Is it morally incorrect to not perceive love correctly? No, not at all, especially when you take into account their upbringings. On the other hand, this is where you might see things like Griffith, who have major flaws that push a narrative in a downward direction. The flaw of being a bastard has a stronger moral implication because of the choices of that character. Denji didn't choose to misunderstand love, but Griffith did choose to try and become king and all the other things that came with it. Finally, we have fatal flaws. Like I mentioned at the top of the video, these are often directly tied to a character's long-term failure or death. There are generally some signposting within the story that will allude to this as well. We watch Light be prideful and arrogant with himself for years that it's believable that he would eventually have a prideful downfall. Other series like Attack on Titan are more directly overt. Quote, everyone is a slave to something. Everybody is a slave to something is a much more tailored and modern version of what a fatal flaw is because it applies the same inevitability as something like a Greek fatal flaw. Of course, if you've seen the end of AOT, then you know how true this idea can ring. The 3 main types of flaw are that simple and that complex at the same time. I'm generally not a fan of trivializing and reducing what are very interesting topics into bullet points, but rudimentary understanding will be more than enough for this video. Like I also mentioned at the top of the video, these concepts were likely to have started taking their more modern form in ancient Greece. Homer, who was infamous for writing the Iliad and the Odyssey already, was using these elements in stories, and much later, philosopher Aristotle would analyze stories like his, naming the broadening idea of hubris to hamartia, or missing the mark. If you needed a modern day equivalent for their dynamic, it would be like Fujimoto writing Chainsaw Man and me making a video on it. While hubris is almost exclusively a flaw to remind the humans how they could never match up to the gods, hamartia was more universal. I hold the opinion that Homer is one of, if not the most influential people in history when it comes to the beginning of the refinement of storytelling as a craft. While Shakespeare can't be ignored as a mastermind, or people like Apollonius predate Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey elevates and executes a tale that not only has maintained its iconic status in the modern day, but also has inspired countless of evolutions in the genre. The introduction and execution of character flaws didn't only serve to end the story, along with the length of the epic would be unequivocally influential for the future of storytelling, so much so to the extent that characters that are without flaw or poorly handled flaws are a hallmark easy indicator of how good character work is. They're a gateway to moral and internal struggle and the bridge by which a story can actually explore themes that have significant weight to them. While an epic of characters that don't explore these things can be interesting, in a way they present a type of story where characters aren't meant to necessarily be experienced in the way that we typically enjoy. Characters that are abundantly or even subtly flawed introduces a human element to them that we are able to attach and bind to. In our last video about characters we see ourselves in, I touched on some of those things that we bind to when it comes to characters, and I think that more often than not, we see the negative parts of ourselves as the things we attach to. It creates a sense that we're not just watching a story happen, but we're experiencing it. Fundamentally, it also may be that we want characters to be flawed just for ourselves. I ran a survey once again that you guys once again pulled through for. A whopping 60% of 123 responses believe that of the options provided, that flaws are what make characters feel relatable/human. In a follow-up question, I asked for a justification on that opinion, and even when people said they picked a different option, most felt the need to at least mention character flaws and how it relates to their answer. The survey I mentioned was disingenuous because I always knew that this spread would turn out like this. In fact, the entire script up until this last minute had already been written before I made that survey. Now, obviously, the survey does trivialize the conversation a bit because in truth, it's a mix of all of those things that can make a character great. Generally, we disliked flawed characters that mishandle the flaws, usually because of some other aspect related to their character or story. And even if a character isn't majorly flawed, if everything else is handled well, most people will generally be able to identify a good character. Another question I asked was, do you generally believe that characters are meant to be related to which an unsurprising 87% agreed. Now, obviously, the dataset isn't explicitly clear, but I think this does suggest that to most people, characters aren't only designed to be related to, but also the element by which they are most commonly and easily able to accomplish that idea is through their flaws. Like I mentioned before though, usually this is only the case when a flawed character is fleshed out, which I also asked that question and requested that some people give their thought out answer. A lot of them overlapped and had a ton of the same points. A fleshed out character is flawed, they go through development and they're nuanced. In other words, a fleshed out character is one that has a strong identity and the story that allows them in to express it the best way that serves the narrative. My Hero Academia gets a lot of flack, but could you tell me in one word the identity of Bakugo and Deku in the first 2 episodes? For Deku, you might think nerd or fanboy, and for Bakugo, you would think bully. From that identity, their flaws are able to be instantly comprehended, and because of how they operate, their identity going forward in the narrative for the foreseeable future is strong because their characters feel at the very least believable. It's not a wonder that Deku and Bakugo are some of the most common characters that people relate to on some level from that series. But the reason I said at the top of the video that character flaws are a lie is twofold. The first and the most obvious is that characters are created with design. The flaws that you or I have are not things that we consciously chose most of the time. They're either inherent or inherited by your environment and upbringing. In a story though, those types of things are decided beforehand. The choice to put a character in a certain situation that would grow those flaws is ultimately up to the author of the story, and therefore can't exactly emulate the flaws that you and I would develop. The second is that character flaws in stories are generally more streamlined and, for lack of a better term, solvable, especially in redemption arcs. In truth, overcoming major flaws in the real world almost never looks like how it does in a story. Even some of the most well-mannered and expertly done redemption arcs can only hope to emulate this type of thing. Characters like Zuko or Endeavor undergo redemption arcs. Zuko even lapses back into his old self for a bit, but even when characters attempt to come out the other side, it was something that was planned all along, but we don't have that luxury with real flaws. Great authors use flaws, weaknesses, and vulnerability to effectively make people fall in love with or hate characters, and by extension for a large number of people, draw them into that character or that story. But what if a story knew this and wanted you to know it as well? Typically, character flaws signpost the arc, are part of the grander narrative, or work toward the focus of the story. But what if instead the focus wasn't on what happens after or in spite of the flaw, but on the flaws themselves? And to examine that, we're going to very briefly look at 3 examples. Slay the Princess is a game in which the princess is an adaptive character, someone who shifts based on your perception of her and her perception of how you see her. This isn't a perfect example, as to get into the character flaws, I would need to spoil things that should be experienced by playing, but on a fundamental level, this idea takes advantage of what we've been talking about. The creator of this game is fabricating adaptive experiences based on the story that they want to tell. Everything about how the princess presents herself is designed to evoke some sort of emotion that elicits a reaction. The way stories use character flaws are the same way. Goodbye Eri is similar in how it zeroes in on the ideas of flaws, only instead of actively having a character change and adapt, It focuses on, instead, the erasure of them. The story's central premise and identity is around perception. The main character, Yuta, at two separate parts of the plot records the daily life of both his dying mother and his dying friend, a girl named Eri. During the filming of both respective movies, the focus character is communicated to us to be more or less a perfect person. Yuta's mother comes off as a loving wife and parent, faithfully and dutifully living out her final days. Meanwhile, Eri comes off as a melancholically cheerful girl, realizing her dream while grappling with her inevitable death. However, both are later revealed to be facades, with his mother and Eri's more negative qualities spoken of after people see the films that Yuta made. In this way, Fujimoto subtly touches on pretty much everything we've talked about thus far, with emotional parts of a character or flaws being expressly dependent on the person who creates the story and what type of story they want to tell. If you're interested in a further exploration of Goodbye Eri, we actually have a video on it because we'll only be touching on it briefly here, and the story is so much more than this one angle, but more or less what Yuta does here is the essence of this video. Both of these characters are stripped away from their flaws, and instead the empathy and relatability arise out of the circumstances around them and how those characters are framed within the circumstance themselves. The focus here isn't particularly on flaws or how they change a character. Instead, it's about a distinct lack of communicating those flaws to the audience to create an illusion. While both of those examples dance around or examine this idea through a meta lens, our final example calls it to light directly. BoJack Horseman is a show that follows the character of BoJack as he navigates his life as a former TV star. But what I find interesting about this series is how it handles these gray areas that most stories just don't. I've seen it said that BoJack Horseman's dialogue and many of the topics are too direct, lacking nuance in how it communicates its ideas, but I think that's part of the intention of the series, to call out in full a lot of the nebulous gray area word for word, and the distinction between characters and quote-unquote real life is no exception. In the episode Free Churro, BoJack says,
"All I know about being good I learned from TV. And in TV, flawed characters are constantly showing people they care with these surprising grand gestures, and I think that part of me still believes that's what love is. But in real life, the big gesture isn't enough. You need to be consistent. You need to be dependably good. You can't just screw everything up and then take a boat out in the ocean to save your best friend or solve a mystery and fly to Kansas. You need to do it every day, which is so hard."
What all three of these examples do better than most others that have flawed characters is show off an extreme. Stories are about the suspension of disbelief, how far you're willing to allow a tale to push the boundaries of what you consider reasonable to explore something familiar through an unfamiliar lens. Stories like these that proxy the rest of the narrative distinctly around the shift, lack of exploring, or lack of clean resolution are more volatile than most others, because they allow the author and the reader a safer space to be a bit more honest. You're able to properly explore some of the more uglier ideas surrounding flaws. What if a flaw isn't fatal or a villain's flaw, but someone less than that whose arc doesn't get resolved, quote-unquote, properly? What if the flaws were more akin to how we notice or experience them in real life? I wouldn't go as far to say authors and writers are manipulative, but the good ones are effective at drawing you in and making you feel a certain way. Manipulation is what it looks like when we see tear bait or rage bait in a story, instead of actually feeling sadness or anger. Regardless though, everything we've talked about I think can get misconstrued into being a bit discouraging, and that's not exactly the intention of this video. I love stories, I love writing, I love character work, and I just love talking about all of them. The notion that flaws in the real world are more brutal and unforgiving than the ones authors create with intention I think is still true, but I also think that idea of them draws something out within us. Even if people in real life or we ourselves lapse more than characters, when we read about flawed characters we see ourselves in or relate to, it stirs something. A lot of the responses from the survey talked about the reason they picked arcs and flaws as the things they think make characters most relatable isn't just the flaw or the promise of the arc itself, but the progression. The idea that a character isn't just a set of flaws and circumstances, but can be something more. There has to be a reason we keep turning a page when the story gets bleak. There's a reason that people keep reading Chainsaw Man even when it's mentally brutal, or a reason why Berserk is still ongoing with its cult-like fanbase. And I believe that both of those offer the same things that we look for when reading and relating to character flaws, and the prospect that those characters can overcome them. The reason we turn the page is hope. Hope for the characters, hope for the stories, and hope for ourselves. Because people can overcome flaws and become stronger than they once were, even if it's a little harder or takes a little longer than stories make it out to be. And until next time, keep dreaming.